So good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Rob Modesto. I'm now your past president of the Association of BC Forest Professionals. Our next plenary session deals with a topic that consumed much of Council's attention in 2018, Bill 49, the Professional Governance Act. This morning we're going to talk about how we got to where we are, what some of the pending changes are, and how that may affect our three organizations. Today with us we have Christine Gelowitz, RPF and ABCFP CEO, Anne English, P.Eng, EGBC CEO, and Christine Houghton, College of Applied Biology CEO. Christine Gelowitz is responsible for all aspects of the Association of BC Forest Professionals business operations. As the primary support for ABCFP Council, Christine works closely with the President and elected Council to set the strategic direction for the organization and ensure strong governance practices. Christine assumed the role of CEO in February 2016 after previously serving on the association for 5 years, including a term as president in 2013. Christine's a graduate of the University of Northern British Columbia, and she has a degree in natural resource management, forestry. And she has been a registered professional forester for since 2003. Prior to joining the ABCFP, Christine spent nearly 20 years with the provincial government in a number of natural resource sector ministries and crown corporations. In her last role with government, Christine headed the corporate initiatives division of the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, where she led the development of the ministry's strategic agenda and was responsible for the ministry's legislative plan and program. Anne English, for the past 6 years, she has been CEO and Registrar of the Engineer and Geoscientists of BC and the licensing body for these professions in BC. Anne is a professional engineer with a degree in mechanical engineering and has a significant experience on projects in the private and public sector. Her most memorable project was the director of BC Hydro's Olympic Initiatives project, which she won many sustainability awards for sustainability and innovation. She is also has extensive training in corporate governance and enjoys providing service to boards in her community and in industry. Anne believes that a regulator can be innovative and entrepreneurial in delivering on its mandate, and she supports and encourages a regulatory approach that recognizes and responds to rapidly changing worlds of engineering, geoscience, and technology. Christine Houghton has been CEO of College of Applied Biology since February of 2017. She has previously led numerous environmental initiatives, including both inside and outside of government. Her work includes successful delivery of critical environmental programs, delivery of complex policy and legislative packages, and effective management of resources. Originally from Manitoba, Christine has lived and worked and studied in Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan prior to coming to British Columbia in 1999. She has a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, diploma in management and administration, and a certificate in education leadership. Once our speakers conclude, we'll have time to take some questions using Pigeonhole. Like many of the other sessions, over the past 2 days, we're going to use Pigeonhole Live, an interactive mobile site. And if you can just switch back to that for a sec, thank you. You'll be able to throw your questions up on board, and we have monitors down here, and we'll queue up our questions from that session. Again, go to pigeonhole.at, select the ABCFP 2019 passcode, and enter into the professional reliance legislation, the road forward button there. So now I'll start off, and just for a bit of background to set the stage for where we got to and where we're at right now. The Professional Governance Act did receive royal assent on November 27, 2018. The Act is based on recommendations 1 and 2 from the Report on Professional Reliance authored by Mark Haddock and released in June of last year. Provisions in the Act will be brought into force through regulation, and the provincial government is currently undertaking consultation with an eye on crafting the first regulations to implement the Act. We expect this process to take 3 to 5 years to complete. And now I'll pass the floor to our own CEO, Christine Gelowitz, for the next few slides, and we have a brief presentation to cover off some of the elements, and then we'll open up to questions.
I think this is working. Okay. So I'll just start off by trying to get the right slide up. There we go. So we'll start with the consultation phase and give you a bit of context there. During the summer, so starting the first week of July, throughout July and August and into the first part of September, the government invited the 5 regulators that are covered under the Act to come together and speak with them about how the Act would be developed and proceed. So those 5 regulators included the 3 organizations represented here. It also included the Applied Science Technologists and Technicians of BC. So some of you may have met Teresa McCurry, who was here with us yesterday but had to leave. And it also included the BC Institute of Agrology. So the 5 of the organizations met with government on a pretty intense, frequent basis through those couple of months. And what we did is we worked through what government intended to do. Government's first approach to developing the Act was essentially to use what you would have seen in the Professional Reliance Review report as the foundation. The recommendations of that report were the starting point for what was going to go into the Act. So if you've read that, the Professional Reliance Review report, which was written by Mark Haddock, you would note what we have today in the Professional Governance Act does have some differences. And that was really a result of some of the successes that we were able to achieve at the consultation table. So I'm just going to talk about the first couple and pass it over to my colleagues about those successes. So one of a really critical, in my view, success that we achieved was to be able to maintain council elections. And in my opinion, it's a pillar of self-governance for the members of the profession to be able to elect professional members to the council. What had been proposed, and the starting point, was that government would appoint all members of the councils of the associations. So that would have included lay members as well as professional members. All of those appointments would have been made by government directly and without an election through our organization. Another significant part related to the council composition, the original recommendation was for at least 50% of the governing councils to be composed of lay members. It was also our opinion that we needed to have a majority of members from the profession, and we did achieve that. They amended that approach, and we maintained a 2/3 of majority will be members of the profession. Excuse me. So for each of the regulators, that meant something a little bit different. Under the Act requires a council of 12. So for our organization, that's the same as what we have, but it will mean that our 2 lay members would be increased to 4 once this Act comes into play. And it's a little bit different for each of the regulators, depending how large their council composition is, but the intention is over time we'll all have 12. Those were 2 really big successes that we worked hard to achieve, and it took quite a bit of our consultation time, actually all the way through to the end, before we were able to confirm those successes in the consultation. So I'm going to pass it over to Anne to talk about the next ones.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk about this really important topic that affects everybody in this room as well as all of our 35,000 members. and also biologists and the other professions that are caught up under the Professional Governance Act. As Christine said, we were able to move the dial during all the consultations that we had, and so we did have some important successes, and we're pleased about that. I would say, I would not be honest with you if I didn't say we still have concerns. There are a lot of concerns, and you're going to hear about those as we go forward. One of them, the next one I'm going to get to, is the whole issue of the cost of this new office. So a new office is being established with a superintendent and with a staff. They anticipate right now that staff might be something like 14 to 16 people that are going to be in that office. So there's a cost associated with that office. When we started to discuss this with them, the approach from government was that all of the regulators would pay for the cost of this office. So in addition to paying your annual fees, you would be paying a portion of the cost of this office in Victoria. We felt that was extremely unfair, and we pushed back very strongly on this item, and really it was difficult. It went back and forth and back and forth. And I think what really finally worked for us was when we said, look, you know, this is unfair. You are penalizing these 5 professional regulatory bodies in a way that you don't penalize the nurses, the vets, the dentists, anybody else. Those professions aren't paying for government oversight of their professions. Why should we have to pay for government oversight? And I think that finally struck home with them. And we said, you know, this could even be a constitutional matter if you want to push it that far. But they finally backed off and said, okay, for at least the first 2 years, this office will be funded by government. The Act has come out. It is silent on the funding of this office and where the funding will come from. But we have had assurance that at least for the first 2 years, that the office will be funded by government. So that was a win. I'm not entirely sure where it's going to go 2 years from now. No, anybody can say. Government can change its mind on issues. We know that. But for now, we don't have to pay for the cost of that office. However, having said that, those would be direct costs. What we are paying for is it's costing us as regulatory bodies to be able to interact with this. And I can tell you that right now, you know, of my staff, there's probably half of them that are involved in some way or other in responding to the demands for information, the discussions that we have to prepare for the regulations that will be developed to support the Act. Because the Act itself is hollow right now. It doesn't actually come into force until there are regulations that support it. So creating those regulations is a huge amount of work, and we all, as regulators, have to be involved in that because the government is not an expert on regulation. We are. So we need to be involved in that. So those costs are being borne by us. So I know this year when our council looks at our budget, that's something we have to build in extra costs for, is to be able to work and try and resolve those problems. So although we won a part of the battle, there's still another piece that we are all absorbing on a day-to-day basis. The other one that I wanted to speak about briefly is this concept that the Act was created to provide oversight and governance, not to get into the nitty-gritty details of regulation. And we have concerns because there are 2 pieces of the Act in particular. One that says that this office of the superintendent can appeal registration decisions. Another one says they can appeal discipline decisions. And so that to us looks like sticking your fingers into our business as a regulator. We've been assured that that is apparently only going to be from the perspective of the process, that an appropriate process hasn't been followed for registration or discipline. However, there's a gray area there, and a legal language can be interpreted in different ways. So that remains a concern. But as I say, right now, we've been told on the one hand that it's only going to work from a governance perspective. On the other hand, we see that regulation, if not done properly, with proper amount of consultation and research, can bring in additional unintended consequences. And now I'm going to let Christine talk about some others.
Good morning. It's I thought when I was walking down the hall this morning, all the do not disturb signs, I wasn't sure how full this room was going to be, so congratulations to everyone here. I want to thank ABC
ABCFP for having this important conversation. As has been articulated already, it has taken up a large amount of time of all 5 of the regulatory associations and will continue to do so. And engagement with all our members across the regulated professional sector is critical to making sure that you're informed, we're informed, and we can help make sure that some of those unintended consequences that have been spoken to, and we will speak to even more, are pushed in the right direction. I'd like to speak about 2 things. One of the real big concerns we had during the consultation was with the amalgamation under one act and the migration to a single ministry, and that ministry being the Ministry of Attorney General, that we would lose touch with those other ministries that actually either make the regulations or employ our members or have direct contact with our members, and it would be going to a ministry that may have expertise in law and governance of the Law Society, but didn't really understand the business of the people who operate in our respective professions. And so we pushed for at least an interface into those ministries, and so what we colloquially call in provincial government the dirt ministries, so transportation, environment, obviously forests and everything else that goes in that ministry, energy and mines and that, for an advisory committee. And that this advisory committee would be also populated by the CEOs of the 5 associations that came under the Act. And that was so we could have the conversations going back and forth about some of the bigger aspects. Yesterday we talked about FERPA and things like that that were being changed. So we thought that was a real victory to be able to have at a high level, at the right level, so at the ADM level, along with ourselves, the ability on a regular basis constituted in the statute, and it is in the Act, to be able to have those conversations. So that was, I think, a very important victory. And then from ourselves, practice rights. We are happy to see, and we never for a moment suggested there should be change to practice rights for the 2 professions here that already have practice rights. Those are important. But if the actual intention was better protection of the public interest, you couldn't do that by being half pregnant and only allowing for at least applied biology, and I will only speak for this profession, not having everyone who's practicing applied biology come under a regulatory body. I will speak more to it later, but it is critical if you're true to your intention and what you want the intention of this whole, or one of the big intentions of this whole exercise has been, is to better protect the public interest. You can't do it by just having some people under regulation and not other people under regulation who have the authority to sign off on various aspects on natural resource legislation and regulations such as the riparian area regulation, etc. So we think that was a positive thing that, again, came at the end of a very long and very exhaustive and exhausting summer of articulating these very points as we went forward.
So, you know, as you can tell from the 3 of us, the things that we pushed for during consultation, you know, we were pretty passionate about the importance of them, why we needed to have them. We articulated our position. And as we did that, it can also appear sometimes that we thought it was all bad. We didn't by any means think the Professional Governance Act was all bad. I think everyone recognizes there's always room for improvement, for continuous improvement. I personally believe there was a simpler way to do it than the Act, but regardless of that, we do have an Act, and so, you know, it's how we best work with it, but also embrace the opportunity that it brings. And so we'd be remiss not to just briefly talk for a few minutes today that there is an opportunity in the Professional Governance Act to better protect the public's interest. There are some elements that will come through this Act that will better able us as regulators to demonstrate to the public that we are protecting public interest. And so despite some of those other points of agreements, there were some components that the different regulators all have different perspectives on them, but there are some components that we all believed will be stronger. From the perspective of the Association of BC Forest Professionals, when we are reviewing what was coming through, one of those areas that does better protect the public's interest are some of the changes that we will see around complaints and discipline. Under the Professional Governance Act versus under our Foresters Act today, there'll be improved definitions around professional misconduct, what it looks like to be conduct on becoming a registrant. And that will help us better deal with things that are around the lack of fitness to practice. If someone, due to mental or addiction issues, has an incapacity to practice, we don't have any way that we can deal with that through our complaint and discipline process today. That would be an example of some improved tools to be able to better deal with those type of circumstances when they arise. It's not a big problem for us, but it can be, and something that can emerge, and this would be something that would also be there. There are a few other things that, you know, I'm a member of this profession, but also sit as the CEO, as a regulator, and from that regulator standpoint, the ability to ensure our complaint and discipline processes work effectively is a key part of demonstrating our accountability is being met. And so there are a few other changes that will assist us to work through that a little bit better. And that includes being able to suspend, you know, and this is under limited and appropriate circumstances, but before the conclusion of an investigation, should there be a clear need to protect public safety. We can also initiate a practice review in the absence of a complaint. And it has some better approaches to use some alternative remedies for complaints, which is something that Casey mentioned yesterday during our business presentation, that it's an area where we think we could do a lot more in. So, you know, a lot of the changes that are going to happen under the Professional Governance Act are really, in many ways, for members, going to be a bit behind the curtain. It's going to impact the way that we implement our business functions as an organization, and some of that will feel a little bit seamless to you. But at the same time, there are a few things that are going to directly impact individuals who are being overseen by the regulators. And that's where we want to spend the rest of our presentation today, is just talking about some of the changes that will have a more direct impact on the individual professionals that are within the profession.
So, as been mentioned, one of the key things is this centralized office of the superintendent, and that's to increase oversight. And just what Christine said, none of us were opposed to oversight. None of us were opposed to increasing or improving oversight, or more positively, our relationship with the provincial government, because they do hold our respective acts right now, and as well we want to work in partnership to be able to make sure that we are in partnership protecting the public interest. But what was a concern for us, and again behind the scenes or behind the curtain as we move forward, is what this office will want from us from an administrative purpose. So already, as you've heard in Christine's presentation at the AGM yesterday, she counted 34 separate meetings just to get this far with government. And that doesn't include all the meetings that we had. And I have to say that one of the things is that we went in with a united voice, which I think was a very positive thing for professionals working in this province, and also was perhaps a little surprising to government that we were working collectively together. But the increased administrative demands upon organizations will impact how we are able to carry out all of our other business and put a strain on our resources. So for my particular organization, which is relatively smaller than certainly EGBC and about half the size of of the Foresters, I'm tripping over my words. Anyway, it puts a whole, we still have to deliver the same amount of information, but with with the same amount of staff at this point in time. So it does put an administrative burden. More to the point on these things was the office doesn't, while it seems to be focused on governance, there seems to be more of a, seems to be a discrepancy in how big it will be. So again, that's a concern for us. But the other thing that's coming forward is the ability for us to enact bylaws without going to referendum for membership, and bylaws that are quote unquote in the public interest. That really hasn't been defined, other than there are 4 things that have come across. If you look in the Act right now, it leaves the door open for other bylaws being passed without going to referendum to the registrants of each organization. It could be a positive thing for some things, but again, it's one of those things we have to stand vigilant to make sure it doesn't have unintended negative consequences.
Thank you very much. Another issue that is a change that will affect everybody here is the election of your council. So I'm not sure what the composition of your council currently is, but I can tell you in the case of engineers and geoscientists, we currently have 18 members of our council. 4 of them are appointed by government. They are lay government representatives on our council, and the other 12 are elected by our membership. Going forward, the size of our council is going to be reduced to a maximum of 12, with still four government appointees, so 1/3. The past president will be a non-voting member, so 7 elected members. So that's a big change to go down from 18, 14 of which are elected, down to 7 going forward. So that's a massive change for us. The other piece that's different is that how they get elected. So in the past, we had 2 avenues for people to run for election. One was to go through our nominating committee. The other provision in our act, and I'm not sure if the other 2 acts were the same, was that in our case, any member who got the signatures of 25 other members of the association could stand for election. And that avenue is now being taken away, and that under the new process, anybody that stands for election must go through a nominating committee. They must be assessed by a merit-based assessment program, and the government is going to give us what the framework for that merit-based program must look like. We expect to get the first outlines of that next week, and then we need to start to embed that into our processes going forward. So that's quite a big change to the elections process. Another piece of it is the involvement of the public. So as I mentioned, there will be 1/3 of the members on the council will be government appointees. But there's also a requirement that there be a layperson on every committee. Now that's a huge difference for us. We didn't have that in the past, and that's going to make a big difference. We're pushing back to try and get some understanding what they mean, because if they're statutory committees, that's different than, say, practicing committees. So we're looking for some further guidance on that one, but that's what the Act says right now. So that's quite a big difference.
So we'll just try to pick up at the pace. We have a bit more time for questions. So I mentioned a few changes will really have greater impact for individual professionals. And we'll just quickly pop you through those, and then we'll get into some Q&As. So I'm going to ask Anne to speak to regulation of firms.
Thanks very much. So this is something that we have been asking government for the past 8 years. Across Canada, there's only 2 provinces that do not currently have the ability to regulate engineering firms and the companies that hire engineers, and that's BC and Quebec. Every other province has this ability, and it's a really powerful regulatory tool. When you think about it, what people do and how they protect the public in practicing as professionals has 2 elements to it. One is what you do every day as a practitioner, and the other is the oversight and influence of the company that you work for. And without those 2 things working in concert, you can't really effectively protect the public. So we have been asking for this other tool for 8 years. We've done a huge amount of consultation on it, worked and met with thousands conversations of members and with companies. We had a task force that involved many companies in BC, and the government has, where it's one of the positive things we see in this act, is that they are going to enable the regulation of companies. I think they are looking to use the model that we have developed, and we will share that model with the other associations as they go forward if they choose to go down that path as well. But we think it's a really, really effective term. It aligns the responsibilities of the company with the responsibilities that we hold our members to in terms of professional ethics, in terms of continuing professional development, in terms of quality assurance. All of those things will be built into the regulation of companies as we go forward. One of the things that we heard from our members as we went out and consulted with them was many said to us, you know, often we feel that we want to do something that we believe is the right thing to do in our practice, but we are discouraged or influenced in a negative way by the company for whatever reasons. Could be economic reasons, there could be other reasons why, but they didn't feel that they were able to actually do what they wanted to do and that they felt conflicted within their own companies. We're hoping that this tool will actually help resolve some of those particular issues. And I'll probably pass that on at this point then.
Another big piece for individual members is the proposed changes around code of ethics, as well as declarations. With respect to code of ethics, as you know, we have our own code of ethics. Under the Act, excuse me. Under the Act, they aim to standardize certain elements of code of ethics across all of the regulators. So when our code was assessed against these general areas where they like to standardize, I think we aligned very well. That can bring some specific changes. And they want to introduce some stronger language around conflicts of interest, the duty to report, some other elements there that we aren't clear how that'll change, but that will have a direct impact on every member in the profession. Another big component, and if you've seen the intentions paper from government, it describes this a bit more, but is the need to file declarations. Currently, what it says under the Act is that for every professional service you provide, prior to providing the service, you must submit a declaration declaring you are competent to do such work and that you are free of any real or perceived conflicts of interest. So as many of you know, how often you're providing professional service, that is a lot of declarations. We're not sure where they're supposed to go when they come to us and what we're supposed to do with it. The Act does allow for exceptions to be made. So this will be a piece where the ABCFP will be inputting back to the government on this piece in particular to help express the business implications that could have for individual members, for companies, but even for the associations to actually do that effectively. So I'll stop there and pass to my colleague.
So we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but practice rights for the three organizations that currently have title rights is an enabling provision in the Act. And if you look at the intentions paper, it states clearly that that it will take place, or that will only be turned on, per se, after there's been a lot of thought put into it, and we fully endorse that. This is not something that we want to rush into and get wrong. In 2003, when the College of Applied Biology Act was enacted, it was the first ever to recognize title rights for applied biology in resource management, and it was a first ever, and that was made BC a leader. This is now a first ever as well. So only speaking for my organization, this is the beginning of a conversation, what it might look like. Certainly been having that with our partners that we do a fair amount of overlap with, and that includes the two organizations here, but as well out there with practitioners. So we want to get as much input as we can so that we can proceed and do it in a time. We're not going to do it the way we did the Act this summer. That's, I think, what I'm telling you. We're going to take the time is required to get it right, because once again, BC is being a world leader in showing the way, if we get there, in resource management by looking at practice rights for applied biology in the profession. So just to close off on what the next steps are, and this is what we were told on our kickoff meeting, and I'm not calling it a kickoff meeting, that's what they called it, a kickoff meeting, because apparently last summer was just a prelude to kicking this off. Anyway, our kickoff meeting in December, which is the intentions paper, which I know you've all read at least once and made copious notes on, and that they're looking at the first regulations coming in this spring in 2019, although that's getting a little bit tight. And that is looking at setting up the Office of the Superintendent moving forward. And then looking at a 3 to 5 year implementation for the rest of the Act to come into force. Personally, I think that's a little bit overly ambitious, that it will take longer than 3 to 5 years, as I said, to get it right, but that there needs to be a work plan going forward. And what's not up here, and what on the slide, and what I think, and this is just my personal opinion, we need to push for, is setting up the advisory committee sooner rather than later, because there's a lot of changes, as I said, to a lot of the statutes our members work under, whether that be FERPA, the riparian area regulations, species at risk. We need to be able to continue that ongoing dialogue to talk about those substantive issues, as well as the governance issues that deal with our respective organizations. So with that, I think we're ready for questions.
So we have 28 questions that have been logged already, so lots of questions. So it's, and it's good. They're all good questions. I was proofing them a little bit, so we'll just get right into it. So the first question is 39 votes. How will the PGA affect the requirement for membership? There's an example around district managers at the ministry, but let's hear the response from Christine first, and then the rest of you also, because it does step into practice rights and title.
I like that we're starting with the easy ones. Under the Professional Governance Act, there are no changes for forest professionals in terms of what our scope of practice is. What it currently is transfers over under this act. They've told us that they have no intention to change any of our rights as it relates to our existing practice rights. So a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to district managers is the same conversation we've been having with government, whether we're still under the Foresters Act or under the Professional Governance Act. The Professional Governance Act doesn't change anything around infringement of practice or ability to deal with anything there. But I'm also at the same time not saying there is an infringement. We've been talking for some time with government about the role of the district manager and when and if that is practicing professional forestry. I've asked a couple times in recent months, with the conversations about making some changes to the role of the district manager, will there be any clarity given about the requirement for registration? It's people have a very divided opinion on it. My personal opinion is that I think there's incredible value. The district manager is a key individual in communities. It's where it's a pivotal position where many people are coming to. I've heard from members who tell me it's really critically important that it's a level playing field, that district managers are engaging with other professionals, and that it's on a level playing field with a professional to a professional. It may, in my mind, be less about professional practice and more about the fact that when we're registered professionals, what that means is we are all held to account to the same standards of conduct, to the same code of ethics, and we can be called to account for how we conduct ourselves. I think that's a critical point about regulation, and it's not always about scope of practice, because I know there's some amazing professionals who support district managers, and they're minding the scope of practice that we have for forestry. But I think the role and when you have a regulated professional, what that's doing is it's allowing the ability for anyone in the public to ensure and have more confidence about the way decisions are being made, and it creates a more level playing field. And so that's a message that I've been carrying in conversations I've been having with government.
Anne and Christine, you want to answer? The question was how will PGA affect the requirement for membership?
Well, I'm kind of looking at one there that has 27 votes for those professional foresters and technologists that do biology work, i.e. fish, streams, wildlife. Will they now have to be registered under the college? I'm going to answer that one if that's okay, Robin.
I'm good.
I
You
like
take
that
charge.
one. That's why they pay me the medium bucks. Anyway, we are going out and having conversations starting in 2 weeks across the province, including the closest one to here is in Kelowna, about what we do about practice overlaps. But let me say that if you're practicing in an area that you're not qualified to practice in, you shouldn't be doing that regardless of where your title or your practice lies. So if you're within your scope of practice and your expertise, and that's an overlap area because we do have a lot with what foresters do, undoubtedly, and vegetation or botanists have a lot to do with what foresters do. We have to figure out how we work together to make sure that we're all operating, regardless if that's practice rights or title rights within our scope of practice. So the short answer is no, not necessarily, but you need to make sure that what you're doing, and this goes for all professionals again, that we're operating within it. For the original question about regional managers and things like that, again, all those other statutes that go along and government policies are a work in progress. And then when we talk about the work ahead, it is to make sure that we have the right people in the right positions, making the right decisions and the right calls moving forward. And we're completely pushing for that across all the associations with government to help make sure that we are all doing our fair share to protect the public interest. And that's professionals, that's associations, and that's the government.
I'll just answer really quickly. I think the answer in our case is no, we do not expect it will change any of the registration requirements of engineers and geoscientists. And maybe at this point I'd just like to say one of the struggles we've had with this whole act and the report, et cetera, was that it's trying to get to a one-size-fits-all solution. Less than 20% of our 35,000 members work in the natural resource sector. Less than 20%. And yet we were drawn up into this, and it is applying to 100% of our members. So that is a concern for us. I mean, for example, there's one of the requirements is going to be around education and ongoing training about truth and reconciliation. And while I totally support that concept, I have a hard time explaining why somebody who's a software engineer working for Google in downtown Vancouver has to pay for that. But anyway, it's this one-size solution that's a problem.
Very good. So our next question then, recognizing that you're not government, what is your opinion on whether or not the Professional Governance Act should apply to equally to government and non-government employees?
So my, this was actually a point during the conversation of consultations with government, is that it doesn't matter who your employer is, the act should apply equally. So there were a few points along the consultation where it was being exerted that it would not apply to government officials. In the act, they moved away from that. And so as of right now, the way the act is written, everything applies equally to all professionals, regardless of who your employer is, government or not. However, there is the ability of the Lieutenant Governor to make exceptions to that rule. And so we don't know how government will handle that, but as of right now, the act applies equally, and I believe that's appropriate, and that's the way that it is best applied.
I'd like to add one thing to that. And when we talk about the regulation of corporations, that is one thing that in our discussions with government, we said this needs to apply completely to anybody who are the employers and who are conducting the businesses of these professions. And I know that government has a bit of an issue with that, with their ministries having to be regulated. However, everybody else that works in this industry, they said the municipal governments definitely should, but they weren't sure about their own ministries. So we're not sure where exactly that's going to end up, but the strong recommendation from us is that it should be everybody across the board. They need to walk the talk. If they believe this makes sense and it protects the public, then it protects the public equally within government ministries.
Just really briefly, the answer is absolutely. And it goes to the same thing with practice rights. You cannot have some people in and some people out. We get complaints, not often, but often enough, that we can't do anything about because those people aren't registered members. And if you take out government employees, and I'm including the federal and municipal governments in there, not just the provincial government, and you take them out, we will not be able to deal with them as a professional association. And that is fundamentally unfair for those professionals who are standing behind their association and their regulations and their code of ethics. So absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Christine. So the next question then is directed at ABCFP, but I'd like to hear from everyone on this because it really does speak to the capacity of the professions to absorb the changes that have to happen out of here. So the question is, how will this affect finances, ABCFP finances, and will we need to increase our dues? But let's hear from everybody on this one.
So for the ABCFP in the short term, it's not going to impact dues immediately, and that's because for many years the ABCFP made an investment back in 2003 when technologists were coming in and dues were increased at that time. That put our organization in a really strong position to start implementing things that are now in the Professional Governance Act that are well established, a peer and practice review program, a lot of other things, 30 pieces of practice guidance for members, over the last decade have been developed, and that has put us in good stead. There are some direct costs that will happen right away. I can tell you our legal bills are a lot higher than what we've been budgeting for, and starting into this year, they are a significant component. Where it's going to impact us in the more short term right now is capacity. It's taking a significant amount of the time of senior staff, of Mike LaRock, of Casey, of myself, of others to be engaged in this process. And that's time that we're not spending on other things that we as an organization already said we wanted to do, working more in towards a continuing professional development program to maintain the competency of members. So, the short answer right now is we don't need to increase dues right now, but we are going to be trading. There's only so much capacity, and you can only do so much work with what you have. So at a point, we'll have to ask ourselves, is the increased workload, once this act gets underway and starts coming, taking away from our ability to deliver other things that are critical and need to move more timely? At that juncture, it could create an increase. But for the time being, right at this moment, it's not something that we're talking about for the immediate term.
So I totally agree with what Christine said. It is absolutely increasing our costs, but increasing the cost doesn't necessarily translate into increased fees. It depends how your council decides to manage their budget. And our council's in the same boat. The other thing is we have to prioritize what we're doing. So if we don't spend more money to work on this, then we have to take other work off our agenda that we currently have. So we're having to shift things around in order to, and important programs and initiatives that we have underway that have had to take a lower priority so that we can attend to this because we have no option but to respond to this. So it definitely increases costs, whether you just consider costs as money or costs of resources, it's definitely increasing it. And how we determine dealing with that down the road, I think our council is looking at lots of different options, potentially increasing fees, potentially taking initiatives off the table, or bringing in levies. All those things are up for consideration, and they will decide on those things when they come up with the next budget cycle.
And I am not going to jump the gun on what's going to be articulated at our AGM in 2 months. And there are some RP bios, more than a few RP bios in the room. But with increased workload comes with all the things my colleagues have said up here. You either drop things or don't do things. As one of the smaller organizations, we have less wiggle room to be able to realign those priorities. And we've done that successfully in 2018. Council, in its wisdom, has recognized there's a need for greater capacity. So we've got the go-ahead to bring some more help on. But over the long term, as we said in the presentation, how much more of a demand this office makes with not potentially having a noticeable positive impact could impact us in ways. And that's why we have to stay vigilant to make sure it's doing what it needs to do to protect the public interest and not creating things for us to do just because.
So the next question is, this came up at our Coffee with Council session yesterday a couple times. So what are the most significant impacts to individual members with the implementation of the PGA?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is opinion, because everyone will perceive this differently. But two things for me that I think will be felt more immediate and have some really direct, tangible things that will change is the duty to report looks very different under Professional Governance Act, and the declarations piece. Those have two significant big changes. The duty to report, as you all know, under a code of ethics, if you observe something that isn't quite working the way you think it should be, there's an obligation to talk to your fellow member to make sure what you're observing, is your interpretation of that correct? You have professional dialogue, you try to resolve it. If you don't, you may find yourself submitting a complaint. It's a little short-circuited in the Professional Governance Act, where there's an obligation to report, but not to have that dialogue. It also is spread across all of the other professions. So you may see something happening, if you're in forestry, happening with a biologist, that duty to report applies there. Tied to that is, under the Act, very different fines and penalties. Breaches of the Act under the Professional Governance Act could result in fines up to $200,000 and 2 years in jail. Under the Foresters Act right now, it's a maximum fine of $10,000. That's a pretty significant difference in a penalty provision for a breach of the Act, which failure for duty to report would be one. So really understanding how we apply that and what it's going to mean, that's going to be very personal for everyone who's in the profession. The declarations, we talked a little bit already, where that has a bit more, I think, on a workload, volume. How will that work administratively? But those two pieces, I think, for individuals are going to be very real feeling, and they'll bring a lot of questions that we'll have to work with government to resolve.
Do you want to, let's just, let's go to the Minister Donaldson question. So Minister Donaldson was here yesterday morning speaking to us, and his opinion that was, from his perspective in the legislative process, that professional reliance was done. Check. And that was that some of us received that differently and had some concern about that. So Christine, what was your opinion on that?
Well, this is a fun one to answer.
Yeah.
I have a little different opinion on that one. I don't think the work is quite done, but it depends on what part we're talking about. The idea of the Professional Governance Act, that work was led and delivered by Minister Heyman in the Ministry of Environment. Although there was a cross-ministry advisory committee or steering committee established, it really was driven by the Ministry of Environment. And there wasn't a lot of involvement, for example, from the Ministry of Forests in some of the details that were happening. It was a bit at arm's length. And so, potentially, from the perspective of Minister Donaldson, that Professional Governance Act wasn't his accountability. It was Minister Heyman's, and that piece is done. But I don't think the work is done. Professional Governance Act, that's the professional part that bolts on to FERPA. And we have to maintain that connection and understand what it means to change the Governance Act in concert with how that interplays with FERPA. We need to have those conversations and talk about that. I also hold that when the Professional Reliance Review first started, and I talked to people and I read the reviews, or the input that came in from the public, a lot of the members of the public weren't saying, oh my gosh, I think there's a huge problem with the individual professionals. A lot of the topics that were coming up were more focused on where the public had an opportunity to influence the way our resources in this province were being used, where their voice in resource management was. That isn't about professional governance. That's about other aspects of the professional reliance model. And I think those questions are still out there. And so there is still some more work to be done. And I'll just close with saying that when the Professional Governance Act was introduced, the news release that I put out said that this is great, you're bringing more oversight to the professions, and we'll accept that and we'll work with you. But when are we going to start talking about the real issues, which is about how we better manage the forest and we address some of those issues and concerns that are coming up? And we pointed back to the stakeholder submission that we made earlier in the year about it's really critical and important that we have more clear direction about what we're trying to achieve at a larger scale on the landscape. Forest professionals, the body of that big piece of non-statutory expectations has grown very large over the last decade of FERPA being in place. We need more direction around those things to bring more clarity. So, you know, my comment was, fine, we've checked the box on recommendation 1 and 2 of the PR report, but there was 121 recommendations in that report. And, you know, when are we going to talk about moving some of those that really do have implications for how forest professionals work? So I believe that the check mark isn't quite done.
So we're running short of time here, so we have time for one more question. So I'm going to bundle up, I'm going to jump ahead of a couple questions, but the 22 and the Kool-Aid question to try and finish on a positive note. So these two questions are really asking us, what are some of the positive outcomes that may come from the PGA, given that, you know, most of our messaging has been about the concerns and how it's going to affect us, but there are some benefits that may help the public interest, protect the public interest. So let's hear from each of you on, you know, maybe what your number one or top two you know, positive things to say are about this.
Sure, and you know, it's always at risk of, it's more interesting to talk about the things that have more questions and, you know, how will this impact us, but we did try to speak a little earlier today that there truly are some good things under this act. I don't think we have anything to fear. When we went through the process with government, one of the first things they did was audit how well we were doing. And we had a clean audit. It said that we were meeting our accountabilities, our responsibilities. I didn't take that as we're perfect and we don't need to do anything. There's always room for improvement and we could do better. You know, the Foresters Act is far from perfect. We make it work, but there are some things that could work better. Complaint and discipline was a component where it could work better. Depending on the relationship with the Office of the Superintendent, there is an opportunity to do more work collaboratively that can help create better tools and supports that can support not just the oversight of what we're doing, but bringing tools that can support professional development and practice. All of those things are there too. It's just they're going to be longer down the road than some of the first concerns that are coming up. But you know, to me, there is opportunity in what is happening with the Professional Governance Act. We just have to be careful not to get lost in the administration that it'll create.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief and answer two of these at once. With regards to why don't we support that more oversight can be a positive thing, and we absolutely agree. Oversight can be a good thing, and the public should demand oversight of all of the regulators. We have no issue with that. What we worry about is bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy that doesn't actually bring any actual oversight. So that's where I would say the difference is. And some of the things that are in this act, we have concerns about that they could be bureaucracy that doesn't actually lead to anything. Requirement for these declarations, that's already covered in our Code of Ethics. Conflict of interest, that's already covered in our Code of Ethics. But now we're bringing it in a different process where we have to manage, in our case, what will potentially be 1 million declarations a year we're going to have to generate a whole IT system to be able to manage that if that's the way it goes. We don't think that's useful at all. However, there are some positive things in this act. The regulation of companies is long overdue. We think that's a very positive feature. Requirement for mandatory continuing professional development we think is a wonderful thing, and that was long overdue. The ability for councils to set bylaws in the public interest, again, that's necessary, and we're happy to see that in the act. So there are some good things here. We just want to make sure it's done right, that appropriate time is taken to look at it from a very researched, prudent perspective, that we don't make mistakes and that things don't fall through the cracks as our act, which is almost 100 years old, disappears and a new one comes in. So that's some of the concerns.
So yeah, just to reiterate, we're not trying to be all negative about this at all, but we want people to understand that we have to, again, be vigilant to make sure that nothing unintended happens that is negative. So that's what we're doing and making sure that you're all aware, and that's why we're here today. But from our perspective, there are as well some very positive things. Absolutely practice rights coming in so that all people practicing applied biology out there in the world have the same ethical and obligations to behave in a professional manner and can be held to account for it. We think that's very, very critical moving forward. So we're happy about that, but we want to make sure that we do it right. Again, just making sure that the road ahead is the right way to go. And secondly, for us, oversight is a hierarchical position, and yes, government has oversight over us because they are current acts now and the professional government acts going forward. But as well, I think this is an opportunity for a better partnership with government as we move forward on recommendations 3 to 121. I think ABCFP has had the best relationship with the provincial government through the Ministry of Forests. Our members are spread over multiple ministries across the natural resource sector. It's sometimes been hard to get the attention of government. So I think not only improved oversight as a potential, as a bonus, but improved partnership and collaboration with the provincial government that most of us work under in some way, shape, or form is a huge opportunity, and we need to take advantage of that and move on it because you, us, the provincial government, we all have a stake in this, in protecting the public interest and making sure we're doing and managing our natural resources as best as we can for the public.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, ladies. I have a small gift for you at the conclusion of this. But you know, again, actually, thanks to all the members, everyone in the room. It's a well-attended session. Really appreciate all the questions. We didn't get to all of them, but if you would like to follow up, I'm available. Morgan, Christine, you can send us these questions, and we can get back to you as soon as we can and try and answer. So thanks a lot, ladies, for taking the questions and for your thoughts on this, and really for all the good work you've done over the last year. It's been important work. So thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to add in closing that when we decided to do this panel, we purposefully passed our mic back and forth, and we took pieces of a single presentation and instead of individually delivering something, because we also wanted to demonstrate that one of the best things that has come out of this process is the very strong working relationships that are now absolutely cemented between these 5 organizations. We worked in lockstep as we worked together with government, but we continue to do that now to this day. We're sharing our tools, we're sharing our resources to the benefit of all of our members. That outcome, regardless of how far we get with implementation of the Professional Governance Act, is something that's going to serve all of us very well going forward. And I hope that we were able to show that that relationship is really solid between the regulators, and we're in a good place to move forward together.